of the Ku Klux Klan, domestic terrorists actually played an instrumental role in upholding this type of policing. They served as a form of community policing, authorized by the former police department, and oftentimes included the very members of the police department who would enact their own types of justice. So domestic terrorists like the Ku Klux Klan and other extreme white supremacist groups, for example, were utilized American law to enact their own, but also the American law enforcement, in fact, enacted their own brutal justice against African Americans without due process. And even the due process was not just and fair. In fact, during enslavement, we know that Africans didn't have any rights, right? And so they didn't have the right to testify in a court of law against a white person. They couldn't bring charges against a white person. And in fact, the laws were designed to simply protect, defend, and honor whites. And as a result of that, then, whatever punishment that whites decided to enact against blacks, including lynching, was always justified. There was no penalty because blacks didn't have any rights. So take, for instance, the criminal act of rape and sexual assault against black women throughout enslavement. Black women were seen as property and under a law did not have any sexual rights or protections under the law. A white woman could not be sexually assaulted without fear of prosecution, for instance. If a black man was accused of assaulting, looking at, inappropriately addressing a white woman as an illustration, he could be hung, beaten, killed, his family could be tortured, and so on and so forth. And in fact, you oftentimes saw this happen even in false cases. However, for black women, there was no protection under the law. Black women, in fact, unfortunately, a lot of historians have erroneously wrote that black women participated in these sexual relationships. They in fact called them consensual sexual relationships. But under enslavement, black women had no right. They did not have the ability to consent. And so if they did not have the ability to consent to these sexual relationships, then therefore it was assault. It was in fact rape. And so we can understand that now. However, during this time frame, white men could sexually abuse black women in a multitude of ways. They could use them as breeders. They could use black men as breeders during enslavement. And there were no protections under the law for them, as an illustration. And in fact, white women could enact her own justice against black women if she found that her husband was engaging in this black woman in sexual relationships. Now remember, while this black woman was being raped, white women could not accept this, in fact, as an act of rape. Instead, they saw this as black women seducing their white men into sexuality. We know these stereotypes of the Jezebel still reign supreme today of black women. But it was not the black woman who's in fact seducing the white male. It was the white male exercising his right over his property, and therefore, under the law, not raping the black woman. However, it was in fact rape. And black women did not consent. In fact, you found black women taking multiple different measures in order to protect themselves from manufactured abortions to prevent having children from their rapists, for example, from running away, mutilating themselves, poisoning, killing their own rapists, and so on and so forth. And so there were multiple measures that they would take, try to make themselves look less appealing, and so on and so forth, to prevent themselves. But at the end of the day, they had no protection under the law. And in fact, policing, one of the strategies for policing to terrorize black women during and after enslavement was through rape as well. And unfortunately, the laws did not provide any protections for black women. And so rape was one of the forms in which policing was used to terrorize both black men and black women. And unfortunately, it has been erroneously recorded as consensual sexual relationships, which couldn't be further from the truth. I give that example to say how up until really the 21st century, there are very few cases in the entire United States of America where a white man has been convicted of the sole crime of rape against the Black woman prior to the 21st century, which is daunting because it says that the Black woman could not be raped. That could not be further from the truth. The Black woman was in fact raped and sexually assaulted, but the protection under the law did not exist for her. She had no sexual protections under the law. She had no protections for her body under the law. And as a result of that, during enslavement, she could be used for sexual exploitation. She could be used for breeding and would not be protected by the criminal justice system that was in place, by law enforcement either. Instead, what you found was that Black women and Black men, the Black communities that were being formed on these plantations, for instance, tried to provide their own levels of protective measures for their daughters, their sisters, their wives, their mothers, and so on and so forth. Another way that policing has been used as terrorism, and others have adopted this model, is through lynching. Lynching, and you may not have heard it in this way before, but lynching was in fact a tactical measure used to instill fear in the minds and hearts of Black Americans. It was designed to embolden whites with the power to dehumanize Black people. And in fact, the use of the public showcasing of lynchings was a calculated approach used to socialize whites into accepting the public brutality and killings of Black as normal and just, while at the same time socializing Blacks to stay in their place in society. And that was their designated place of inferiority. So remember now, you might have seen some iconic images of lynching where you see everyday average white Americans standing dressed in normal clothing, not just in the Ku Klux Klan attire, but in normal clothing, as African people were being lynched during enslavement and after. They will have their children stand in front and watch. And they didn't end with their own children, because remember, they were socializing whites into thinking that the public brutality and killing of Blacks is normal and just. So you think about, this has been going on for centuries now, of this idea that the public brutality and killing of Blacks is normal and just. White children have witnessed this. So it has socialized the public into accepting this type of mistreatment, this dehumanized treatment against African people as appropriate and the normal way of being. And so not only did they end it with their children, but they were also stand Black children in front as their fathers, uncles, brothers, mothers, sisters were lynched, as an illustration, to teach them to stay in their place and teach them that these are the consequences if you do not follow the social order in which the American society has established for you. And so by looking at the act of lynching, we can see how the policing was used as terrorism, because it wasn't just, remember, before there was a foreign police, lynching was used in this way. With the formalization of police in the 1830s, we saw that the police also used this. In fact, for Black women during this time frame, it wasn't simply enough to lynch her if she was deemed to be put in possession of higher spiritual power, or deemed to be a quote unquote witch. They would attempt to kill her to death. An extreme measure, because unlike if the white woman was accused of being a witch, she was hung, for example, or burned at times, rarely burned, but most often hung or beheaded. A Black woman was killed twice to make sure, because they believed that she possessed a more demonic spiritual power. And as a result of that, what you found was she was often hung and burned, right? So it wasn't enough to hang her. They hung her body and then will burn her body, as an illustration, or hang her body and behead her, and so on and so forth. Because it was the idea that Black women were the most demonic of witches, that they possessed this demonic level of spiritual power, and as a result, they had to kill them twice to make sure that they were in fact dead. And so this was another form of this type of policing that was enacted, of terrorizing Black lives and Black families even throughout enslavement and to this day. And unfortunately, even here in California, we still see acts of lynching taking place. We know some recent cases that have come up, and this public showcasing of the public showcasing of Black bodies hanging from trees as an illustration, right? We still see, unfortunately, hatching itself out in the 21st century. Here it is, 2020, and we're still seeing these things because it's once again a reminder of how America terrorizes the Black community into submitting to an unjust and brutal system of existence. And so that's why you still see lynching popping up today, because it's a constant reminder of the systematic attack and assault on Blackness. It reminds us that America has shown itself to be anti-Black. And that might be radical for some of you all to accept. But I challenge you all to think about historically, and we'll see this throughout today's lecture and tomorrow's lecture, historically how America has gone to war against African Americans and other groups, but in particular, we'll focus today on African Americans. Whenever African Americans have attempted to transform America to be a more inclusive and just society. So keep that in mind as we go throughout the lecture. The great thing is, despite this terroristic idea of, remember, the creation of policing was designed to maintain this racial caste system where Blacks were legally inferior, with no equal protection under the laws, no rights, no protections for their lives, their sexual freedoms, their bodies, their children, right? So remember, enslavement allowed African people to not only be bred, but also you could take and sell at any moment the mother, the father, the children. But African people didn't simply accept this. Despite it trying to destroy that which was community and family, African people, because of their resiliency, the strength of their knowing of their being, what they did instead was advocate for themselves in a multitude of ways. And that by that, they fought for their freedom. The fight for freedom, in this sense, started from the moment oppressive systems attempted to invade Africa and African people's humanity. And so African people rebelled in a multitude of ways. I mentioned a few ways in terms of Black women and sexual assault, how they attempted to rebel. But African people, of course, we know, ran away from plantation sites and other oppressive places. There were revolts, some more known than others, like Denmark, BC in 1822, and Nat Turner in 1831 as some illustration. But it wasn't just levels of escape and sometimes violent revolts, which were deemed necessary. And remember that violence was enacted as a response to the terrorism that African people were experiencing. So if you see policing as terrorism, then the appropriate response to terrorism would be, right, to violent terrorism would be to use violence in order to stop that type of violent terrorism or to defend yourself against violent terrorism. So these revolts, including Nat Turner's 1831 revolt, in which he killed over 50 white enslavers, as an illustration, he and a group that went out, what you saw was that was an appropriate response for the type of violent terrorism that they were experiencing, right? If you see slavery as violent terrorism, you see policing as this violent terrorism against African people's humanity, then any response that African people gave to protect and defend their humanity was just and appropriate. But it didn't end there. Some of the most significant ways in which African people revolted and rebelled against enslavement was through family formations. We know of the iconic jumping of the broom, right? While marriage among enslaved Africans was not legal, African people still saw themselves as humans, still saw themselves as worthy of family, still maintain the African worldview and the desire to be communal and maintain family formations. Family was still, and familyhood was still highly essential even during enslavement. And so they formed their families and created this symbolic representation in front of their community and their God to be able to jump the broom as a spiritual and community sign of their union, despite it not being legally recognized by the state. And so they attempted this even with fear of family members being killed, being sold, being exploited. Even with those types of fears, family maintained a level of high importance among African people. Another way in which African people rebelled was through, in terms of utilizing their culture to rebel and maintain their humanity, was through their spirituality. While some were forcibly, Christianity was forcibly introduced to Africans under enslavement, under the guise that in order for them to be counted as partial human beings under the 3/5 clause, they had to be Christianized. So prior to this idea of needing to count them for representation, Africans were considered 0% human. It wasn't until this compromise came in order to count the population, the enslaved African population, as part of the population in these southern states. The compromise was the 3/5 rule. And so Africans were then considered 3/5 of a human. But before they become 3/5 of a human, they had to be Christianized. And so Christianity was then forcibly introduced onto African people during enslavement. And it was not introduced as a system of spiritual upliftment and enlightenment. Instead, it was introduced as, once again, a policing tactic, a spiritual policing tactic, in order to maintain African inferiority and white superiority. Africans were not allowed to read or write or attend church services with whites. This is most commonly the case. However, Africans rebelled by still reading, by teaching themselves to read, teaching themselves to write in English. They could already do this. Many of them could do this in their own native languages and so on and so forth. But over generations, you saw that some of those things being lost. And so instead, what you saw was concepts being maintained. So what Africans started to do was, they didn't necessarily fully accept Christianity, but they used Christianity as a disguise to maintain their own African spirituality. You will see many cases where they were created different, for example, on the Yoruba Orishas, for example. In fact, Ifa maintained a high presence in Europe among the Yoruba people and other peoples who were enslaved in the southern states of America and in the Caribbean, such that you still see some modified forms of the Ifa spirituality practiced to this day. Voodoo, Santeria are some of the examples. But this was a way in which they were able to rebel and maintain their spirituality while being forced to openly practice Christianity. They were still able to do this in a multitude of ways. They used Christian hymns and spiritual songs to, create secret codes in order to escape, for example, in order to plot rebellions, in order to plot the destruction of crops and so on and so forth. So they were very organized and strategic in how to utilize their African ways of being in order to maintain their humanity during enslavement and, in fact, to rebel against enslavement. So their fight for freedom was a constant, nonstop fight. And you still see this fight for liberation of African rights and humanity taking place today. Another major one that many of us have heard of is the Underground Railroad. It was a sophisticated escape system designed to aid Africans to freedom. Most notably known through this is Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, as some illustration as Douglass linked to the abolitionist movement. But what you found was that the Underground Railroad was designed to aid and assist African people on their journey to escape to freedom. And by freedom, that's why I say we'll talk about it a little bit more now. By freedom, it meant freedom from the plantation, right? Freedom from enslavement. But that freedom didn't mean that they were in fact equal in society. It didn't give them equal protection under the laws, as an illustration, even when they went up to Canada, because we have to remember that there was enslavement and slavery being practiced in Canada as well. But what it meant was they were free from the structure of enslavement on plantations, as an illustration, but they did not exercise the same human rights or citizenship rights as white Americans, as an illustration. The abolitionist movement was another significant movement that we saw taking place simultaneously with the Underground Railroad and the rebellions. But this was more in the 1830s, where it was really at its height, where you saw the majority were free Black people, such as Frederick Douglass, and white supporters who led the movement to secure the freedom of enslaved African people. And they would aid in the Underground Railroad, they would aid in legal and political campaigns, and so on and so forth. And so what they were arguing was that African people deserved the right to be free. They in fact were human, and that their freedom was the only just and right thing to do. Now we know that that was a very contentious position to take during this time frame in American context. It led to a civil war. That war and the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation is noted as the significant shift in the period of enslavement where it caused the end. But in fact, we know that although the Civil War ended, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, that African people were not free or not all free from enslavement. It wasn't until 3 years later when soldiers finally made it to Texas to be able to announce that, under federal law, African people were free from enslavement. But what led the next step, which is the next phase of the racial caste system, what was next to come was Reconstruction, and it was full of faulty promises. Because although emancipation came from the system of enslavement, it did not grant African people equal human rights nor equal citizenship rights. So I'll pause here and take a few questions from the first section of enslavement as the first wave of the racial caste system, and how policing was established as a form of terrorism against African lives and bodies. And Jessica, I didn't know if there were any questions in the chat.
I don't see any questions, but folks, feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourselves, or go ahead and insert it in the chat.
Okay, so if there are no questions at this time, then I'll move forward with the next set of slides, and that's we're focused on Reconstruction and the Jim Crow era. So after emancipation, the idea was that we were going to restructure the nation, its laws, its practices, to be inclusive of all American human rights. That was the hope. However, what we found was that Reconstruction failed to do this. Instead, Reconstruction resulted in what we know of as Jim Crow, and it was a legal system of segregation that lasted from in 1865 to 68 to 1965 with the signing of the Civil Rights Act. And so under Reconstruction, you saw that, take for instance the case of Louisiana, you saw that many African people immediately tried to move into and successfully moved into political office, moved into political positions, and to change laws to be inclusive and to grant citizenship rights to African Americans. However, by the turn of the century, what you saw was that all of them were forced out because Jim Crow was introduced. All of them were forced out of those positions because they could no longer legally serve as political representatives. They no longer had rights over land and so on and so forth in the state of Louisiana territory, if you look at that particular case. But so under this, you saw the subordination of Africans was based on race once again. So race maintained itself as a factor, and African people had no rights, and there was no equal protection under the laws. And under this time frame, you also saw there was a major growth of white supremacy and white privilege, right? And so you know the iconic images of whites only restaurants, restrooms, hospitals, hotels, just public spaces, whites-only spaces on buses, and so on and so forth. Such that it was the idea that although Africans were now deemed free from enslavement, they were still seen as inferior and not equal to white people. And as a result of that, could not be trusted to coexist in society in the same spaces, and should not be trusted with the same rights and privileges, including the right and privilege to be able to serve on a jury, to testify in a court of law, to press charges against a white person. All of those things were not things deemed worthy of African people in this country during the Jim Crow era. So what you found was this idea of Jim Crow, and media played an important role. I think you all may have heard of the original film, The Birth of a Nation. It's highly applauded, but it really was, unfortunately, was a media production designed to promote this new racial caste system where African people were once again placed in a legal inferior position, represented as untrustworthy, criminal, unintelligent, and unable to function in society without having whites rule over them, right? This is what this film was designed to do, to maintain that social order, that Blacks were inferior and whites were superior. Blacks could not be trusted. They should not have guns. They should not have political power. They should not have land ownership, and so on and so forth. So media played, the early stages of media played an important role in maintaining and socializing the public into accepting these faulty notions of African people. What you saw here with Jim Crow is that it was this idea to be able to segregate the society, right? Social settings, public spaces, cities, towns, by race. And Blacks did not have the same rights. For instance, during Reconstruction, Blacks didn't walk away from plantations with the promised 40 acres and a mule. They didn't walk away with educational institutions to go into. They didn't walk in place with housing structures to buy or to go into. Remember that the reparations promise never came. Hence the current call, and that it really has been an ongoing call since emancipation, but it has really been this ongoing call for reparations because African Americans never got those 40 acres and a mule or any of the other promises that were to come. Instead, what you saw was that white men in particular, white men in particular, were granted up to 120 acres to move westward from past Louisiana territory, so Texas to California, and largely a lot settled in the Arizona areas, for example, Texas area, the spaces between, but you saw the move westward, the U.S. moved westward, and the expansion of the U.S. territory to the west. White men in particular were given up to 120 acres to move themselves and their families out to populate the land and occupy it as American territory. And so as a result of that, even if African Americans received, which we did not, 40 acres and a mule, we would still be significantly behind the 120 acres that white men received to move westward, as an illustration. Some of the contradictions here with this whole idea that Blacks were now free, it was the idea around what freedom actually meant. It wasn't freedom of human rights. It wasn't freedom of citizenship rights. And it wasn't freedom to be protected by the police and under the law. And so this long-standing distrust of police for African-American community primarily is rooted in the very creation of the police and the use of the police to maintain a strategic position of dominance and terror over African lives. And so during Jim Crow, they maintained this order. They were the ones who aided in making sure that African Americans did not enter into white-only spaces. They were the one who did the penalties, but it was also allowed, the white public was also allowed to enact their own penalties as well, including the continuation of lynching, of rape and sexual assault against Black women, beating, and so on and so forth. You all know of the iconic case of Emmett Till, but there are hundreds of thousands of those cases that have not been publicly known. But this was a common practice among white Southerners and white Americans in general, not just in the South, but in the North as well. Many people have the false perception that the North was this more liberal, equal, inclusive space, but Blacks could not enter into the same hotels as whites could not. So that's why, for example, in New York, Harlem was such an epicenter for Black musicians and entertainers and just Black folks in general, because they could not travel equally throughout Manhattan. Even if you were performing at a club or hotel in other spaces in Manhattan, you could not stay at those hotels. You had to enter into the back doors, go through service entrance, and so on and so forth. So this was some of that racialized reality. Freedom was not, in fact, freedom in terms of rights, freedom of humanity, and freedom of rights in that sense. Instead, you saw that the racial caste system of Jim Crow allowed for a more sinister form of policing to happen under the law, right? By way of justifying each of these acts. And so the Jim Crow era allowed for this, the American social order to continue to place African people in an inferior position. So once again, I stated before, no equal protection under the laws. Remember, I've already stated that Black women, the cases against a white man being convicted of the sole crime of rape against a Black woman prior to the 21st century are almost non-existent. As an illustration, there was limited to no political representation, lack of economic opportunity. There was never those 40 acres and a mule granted, so there was a lack of land. And then this anti-African sentiment continued and gave creed to the rise of hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan. One of the things in terms of the economic structure and powers that aided in maintaining this racial social order and keeping Africans in an inferior position was around economics. So take, for instance, you all might have heard of the stereotype of the watermelon in Black folks, right? The stereotype that all Black folks love watermelon. One, it's a stereotype, wholly inaccurate, not based on any empirical evidence. Two, you have to understand the racist history around the watermelon stereotype. So during the Reconstruction and Jim Crow era, I remember African Americans walked away from enslavement with zero land, zero money. So many of them were forced into the system of sharecropping, where they would live on the land of these former plantations, work the land for these whites, and then owe them money. After whatever they produced on that land for them that they sold, they will oftentimes still result in a debt, saying that their living expenses outweigh the amount of income that they brought in for them. Wholly inaccurate. This is another way of exploiting African people. But what you saw was that African people were savvy in their economic approach. What they tried to do was find inexpensive ways to generate larger amounts of money. So what they would do was invest in things like watermelon seeds. The watermelon seed was extremely inexpensive. They could grow the seed, and from there, they would take that now you get a large fruit. They would be able to gain a lot more money from the watermelon versus the watermelon seed. So because whites saw the economic power that they were using, Blacks would take the money that they were using from selling the fruits, in particular the watermelon, as an illustration, and take that to fuel other businesses, to buy land, to be able to start other businesses, and so on and so forth. Whites saw this as a threat to white power and white privilege. So what they began to do was create a smear campaign against Black watermelon sellers and say that the watermelon, right, that Blacks eating the watermelon made them crazy, criminal, in terms of not only violent, but sexually deviant. And so by eating the watermelon, then Blacks became even more aggressive and uncontrolled, and therefore they will publicize these things in ads and campaigns and print media, and then announce them. And whites would go out and destroy Blacks' watermelon stands and fruit stands and so on and so forth, as a way to cripple their economic power. But it was this creation of this stereotype really came from this idea of Black economic power meant, or Black economic mobility meant economic power. And that challenged the idea of white supremacy. And especially during this time frame, by challenging this idea, it meant that if Blacks can develop economic power, they may be able to gain political power. They may be able to gain social and cultural capital, and that threatened white supremacy. And as a result of that, the creation of this stereotype around Blacks and watermelon was established, along with a multitude of other stereotypes. The Black man as inherently sex crazed and with a desire to subdue and assault the white woman. You saw this also in Birth of a Nation, right? Where the Black man, the sight of the white woman, he was so uncontrolled. These were all stereotypes to justify hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan, these white supremacist terrorist groups, these domestic terrorists, to continue to enact terror against Blacks, which was designed to keep them in a particular space, an inferior space. This was the American social order. Blacks at the very bottom and whites at the very top. So any and every instance in which whites' position of power, their superiority, was being challenged, whether that was via Black economic power, Black education, which I'll give an example of that as well, and then it was directly ridiculed and attempted to be destroyed. Blacks have been very resilient and rebellious over these things and found other ways to secure economic means and so on and so forth as well, despite the smear campaigns and attacks on their attempted towards economic mobility. Another way in which African Americans attempted to challenge this new racial social order was through education. Wow, remember when they walked away, there was no educational institutions to go into. African Americans be able to continue to create, because they just started this during enslavement, but to continue to create their own educational, community educational systems. And in fact, that became one of the first public models of education in America. And public education, in terms of being public and community and based in communities, was really pulled from African Americans' community-based education. So what we know of as public education today was modeled off of African Americans' resiliency and desire to be able to dive into education and creating their own community-based education. When we introduced the idea of public schooling, we saw that Africans were segregated from whites in the South and in the North. And you saw the same types of things happening. But in the South, what you saw was clear illustrations of difference in economic investment into schools, the physical structures, the resources, textbooks and materials, and so on and so forth. And so you largely had Blacks educating Blacks. And as a result of that, you saw Blacks colleges and universities, which we call now HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, being created as well in order to educate, because remember, African Americans could not enter, even in the North, in these spaces, enter into these educational institutions. But African Americans saw the value in this form of education in order to advance in American society. And so they resisted by this social order by, in fact, investing in their own community-based education and developing their own public schools, developing institutions of higher education, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, you still saw other areas with this racial caste system and segregation. So segregation, I want you all to keep thinking about it. So segregation was economic. Segregation was in terms of education. Segregation was also in terms of healthcare. So African Americans were denied access to quality healthcare in America. There was no public healthcare system available to them, nor did they have access to whites-only hospitals, which were the majority of the hospitals in American society. And so they were primarily utilizing their own healing practices, and then their own midwives would be the ones who primarily birthing their children, and so on and so forth. But as a result of the knowledge that they were gaining through their own educational institutions, you saw that African Americans began to create their own Black hospitals. So some of the first hospitals in the nation that served African Americans were Black owned and Black operated. With the fight for civil rights, we saw that a lot of those shortly after disappeared as the resources and funding from the federal government poured into the new hospitals based in African American communities, which unfortunately gained horrible reputations. Like King Drew Hospital and Medical Facility gained a reputation, the negative term was Killer King, you might have heard of, but it was like that across the nation. And it gave that idea because while it was designed to be this first publicly funded, state-funded hospital in a Black community, largely operated by Black staff and doctors, with the oversight was primarily done by the state. So, for instance, the state controlled the payroll, it controlled the hiring, and so on. And what they did was they underfunded King Drew Hospital Medical Center. And this is public documents. I'd be happy to share links of many articles about this. But King Drew Hospital was underfunded and understaffed. And oftentimes staff would less competent or less experienced workers. I should say less experienced more so. So fresh out of medical school, fresh out of their nursing programs and so on and so forth. And there will still be limited staff. So King Drew gained this negative perception by the community, the Black community, because individuals will go in with controllable life-threatening issues and would die. There were often deaths in hallways and so on and so forth. And this was the case in the South as well. I'm from New Orleans. Some of the public hospitals are known for this as well. They've been shut down over the years, where individuals go in with car accidents, sitting in hallways, not being treated, and not making it out of those hallways, as an illustration. And it wasn't because it wasn't based exclusively on incompetence of staff, but it was underfunded, overcrowded, understaffed hospitals, right? And as a result, they did not meet the medical needs of the community. And so unfortunately, still in like the area where King Drew was, the majority of residents have to travel 20 minutes without traffic to the nearest hospital. So there's still these injustices in healthcare that still exist today. Hence the need for more universal, high quality healthcare. And healthcare, quality healthcare, access to quality healthcare is a part of the call for reparations still to this day as well. Another area in which we see this, so we see it in economics, we see it in education, we see it in healthcare. Another major area was in housing. So we saw during this era, African Americans were restricted in terms of their ability to move into housing structures as well. So in Los Angeles, take for instance, there were Black zones, not just in Los Angeles, but across the nation, you would see this, in Black zones. And those Black zones were the zones in which African Americans could stay. In Los Angeles, we saw majorly, no matter how wealthy you were as an African American, you were largely restricted. It wasn't until those Civil Rights Act removing the racially restrictive covenants on housing that African Americans could move out. In San Fernando Valley, since we're here located, Pacoima was one of the only places in which African Americans could actually reside. And Pacoima became an affluent Black community. So doctors, lawyers, educators, and so on and so forth were the first ones to move into the Pacoima area. And it wasn't until the end of the Civil Rights era, the introduction and the removal of racially restrictive covenants, that those affluent Black folks could move out into other neighborhoods and communities. But what challenged the areas in Pacoima was also the building of public housing structures with lack of resources into those communities to be able to best support families in more harsh economic needs. And so it's the dynamics, and plus we know about the harsh policing. That right up the street from the Discovery Cube is where the beating of Rodney King happened, as an illustration. Many people don't realize that they happen right here in the valley, right in Pacoima. And so there's a terroristic history around Pacoima that stigmatizes Pacoima to this day, but it's actually an affluent Black community. It was one of the only places where Blacks could actually reside in the valley in California. And so this racial social order created these systems of segregation and inferiority in literally every sector of American society. We can talk about environmental injustice. We can talk about injustice in terms of the policing practices, which we will, and we'll focus more on that in the second lecture, the modern day policing practices. But you'll see how this new racial social order of Jim Crow really created this separation among the races, as opposed to this idea of Reconstruction was going to create a more inclusive American society. The idea of the all men are created equal, the idea of the American dream being achievable, never manifested itself for African Americans, among other groups. We can say the same for our brothers and sisters in our Latinx community. We can say the same for our indigenous populations and so on and others, right? But the idea of achieving this American dream never manifested itself. It was never designed for the African American. But not only that, the American dream never really was produced with the African in mind, right? So if you think about it, the American dream is largely cemented on this idea of being able to achieve a certain lifestyle in America. You all have heard it. It's the idea of the husband and wife, 2.5 kids and a dog. You get to own your land, has to have job security, to be able to own your house, have job security to be able to pay for that house, and so on and so forth. Your children can go to school and be educated, right? Well, if you think about it, when we look at the Jim Crow era and this American social order that was established, that was not possible without African people creating it for themselves with new meanings. One, the concept of the husband and wife, 2.5 kids and a dog, didn't fit the African family model, right? Nor did it fit many other family models, but it didn't fit African family models of the extended family network, of the communal family systems. It didn't really fit that model. Two, the additional things, the privileges afforded in the American dream were never afforded to African Americans during this time frame, right? Remember, these covenants were racially restricted. They couldn't live in certain places. They didn't have the opportunities to move forward in certain areas. And so all of those things were prohibited Africans' rights and freedoms. And in order to maintain that Africans did not challenge the American social order, the police were extremely instrumental in holding Africans and the American public to a racist society. You're maintaining that racial caste system. And so African Americans had to resist this, and they had to resist this, and the racial social order. And so, and resistance in the racial social order. And so one of the ways in which policing by way of formal policing and informal policing was through anti-Black domestic terrorism, was used to maintain this social order. So this came by way through the police and through terroristic groups and white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. In 1866, the birth of the Ku Klux Klan was officially formed and empowered white citizens to enact their own racialized system of justice, which terrorized Black citizens with lynchings, beatings, mutilations, and rapes, among many other dehumanizing acts of terror. And so what you saw was, I've given you several examples of their tactics. I don't really need to go over and over with them, some of the actions that they've done. But what you saw was this is really a way to maintain that social order that we just laid out in every single sector. So for instance, a Black woman could go to a whites-only hospital and attempt to, if she was pregnant, attempt to have delivery. She was forced out by the medical staff, and if she refused to leave, the police were the ones who would drag her off, incarcerate her, for example, and so on and so forth. If African Americans attempted to sit at lunch counters in which they were, or in restaurants attempted to get a meal, they were dragged off by both public citizens, white public citizens, as well as the police. The Ku Klux Klan helped in this anti-Black domestic terrorism, because they were oftentimes first on the grounds. And remember, they were, in fact, most often part of the police departments as well, right? In the day, for example, they may have on their police uniform. In the evening, they have on their Klan uniform. just as an illustration. We've seen many historical cases lay this out. So it's not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of historical fact that many police officers, chiefs of police and so on and so forth were directly involved with, and members of, and political representatives as well, members of the Ku Klux Klan. And so what you see here is that they helped enact this. In the case of Emmett Till, it was the public, right? This public lynching, although he wasn't physically lynched, it was this public lynching of Emmett Till by this accused act of disrespect towards a white woman, right? Led to a child being mutilated, dragged, body just physically destroyed, right? By these white citizens enacting their terrors to say that this will never be tolerated. The potential of looking at a white woman, the potential of flirting with a white woman would never be tolerated. The Ku Klux Klan played an essential role in this anti-Black domestic terrorism. In fact, you could not do anything to a white woman, a white man, a white-only space and still be terrorized because it was designed to invoke this level of fear in African Americans. This domestic terrorism was ongoing nonstop. The burning of Black churches, the burning of Black homes, the burning of Black bodies was constant, as an illustration, the burning and bombings of these spaces. And so the civil rights movement really attempted to challenge this racial social order and really destroy it, right? It attempted to transform the American society away from this type of terrorism on Black bodies and on Black lives. And so the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s was a socially and politically conscious movement advancing the citizenship rights of Blacks. Expanded from the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education Voting Rights Act and to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And really through 68 when you saw some of the later bills around, the acts around housing and so on and so forth. But that's the legal, in terms of the Supreme Court ruling, the legal rules around it. But really, you saw the struggle for civil rights has been happening since the moment in which African people were enslaved, post-enslavement, and the first wave of the civil rights movement was happening in the 1920s. And then we saw the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s, the most iconic phase of the civil rights era. What you saw was it was representing African Americans' fight for equal rights, for equality, for justice, and it was and by the signing of the Civil Rights Acts, it signaled the official end of the Jim Crow era. And that was the second racial caste system. Excuse me, the Civil Rights era, it was very tactical and strategic in the public marchings, the public boycotts. Those are some of the iconic things. But many people don't realize that the current calls for economic reparations were part of that civil rights era. The calls for employment opportunities and equality and employment was a part of the civil rights era of the 1950s and 60s, and you still see it today. It wasn't just a matter of boycotting buses and restaurants and so on and so forth, but the boycotting of businesses was essential part of the civil rights era. Take, for instance, the selective patronage campaigns of the 1930s and the 1960s. We'll look at the 1960s for this case. But you see that the selective patronage campaigns, they targeted companies that denied African-American employment and or equal opportunity for professional advancement. Take, for instance, in Philadelphia, African-Americans attempted to transform their spending power into a means to force major corporations to adhere to hiring regulations and employee quotas outlined by African-American ministers. So it was equality demands for opportunity. They were demanding that there be equal opportunity in employment practices. So the multi-million-dollar corporations such as TBC, Tasty Cake, Sun Oil, these were major plant facilities in the Pennsylvania and Philadelphia region of Pennsylvania. Pepsi Cola, Coca-Cola, 7-Up, Gulf Oil, Atlantic Richfield, and Standard Oil were forced to restructure employment practices because of the selective patronage movement. What essentially Black communities did in Philadelphia and across the nation was they refused to pour in their money. They said they would not buy a single product from Pepsi Cola no matter where they were sold, if Pepsi Cola didn't employ a certain percentage of African Americans from their community and also pour a certain percentage of their money back into their profit back into the African American community. And because of the economic demand and the loss of the black dollar, that black spending power, right? Those companies quickly folded when they boycotted those companies and their products. And they quickly folded. Unfortunately, the success of the Selective Patronage campaign, while significant, was short-lived, because shortly after this period in the 1960s, many of those companies moved their production overseas, right? So many of those plants end up closing. However, it was very significant in that it showed the ability of black spending power to advance equality and opportunity, right? And so when you see this current call as a part of the Black Lives Matter movement, as an illustration, this current call for companies to not simply make statements saying that, oh, we stand in support of the Black Lives Matter. What they're saying is that statement is not simply enough. You need to back it up with your dollars and your practices. That's part of a long-standing campaign and tradition of African Americans fight for equality. It's not anything new. This is something that is on a continuum where African Americans are using strategic approaches to demand for equality. So you see currently African Americans in supporting communities advocating that companies not only make these statements, but okay, back it up with your employment practices, back it up with your payment, your payroll practices and your salary practices, and back it up with your political contributions and who you're supporting. So certain companies are making these statements. You've seen them, right? We all have, making these statements, but then they're pouring their dollars into campaigns that are anti-Black campaigns, that are Latinx campaigns, that are anti-Indigenous campaigns. And so we see these communities saying, we won't support these businesses and their products if they continue to pour their dollars into candidates and campaigns that are anti-Black, as an illustration. And so the Selective Patronage campaign is a powerful example of how Blacks utilize their resources to advocate for their rights and resources and equality in American society. And really that's the power of Black protest. So we see, as an instance, in the 1950s and 60s, during the height of the civil rights movement, the warring battles against African Americans intensified. And that's why, remember I mentioned before that America has gone to war against African Americans. We moved from not having police to formalizing police to militarizing police, right? Over the years, and all of this was designed to maintain this racial social order of Black inferiority, of Latinx inferiority, right? Of Indigenous inferiority. All of these things were designed around that. And so they used war tactics. Literally, we've seen military tanks roll out and the military roll out in American streets in order to defend America's position of inequality and injustice, right? So African Americans experience direct violent actions and terrorism in an attempt to deter their fight for equal citizenship rights. Even when the use of nonviolent protests, nonviolent protests by African Americans, Americans still unleash authorized violence against African Americans to destroy their will to fight for full citizenship. We saw police departments across the nation sanction officers to use water hoses, dogs, beatings, arrests, sexual assault, and killings to dismantle peaceful protests, to dismantle the will of Black, fight for equality. However, African Americans remain committed to their fight for equality, which resulted in the signing of the Civil Rights Acts of 64, 65, and 68, which ended legal segregation and discrimination. That will and the power of Black protest is what ended this second wave of the racial caste system in America, right? And we'll find out in our next lecture what happened from there. Was a new racial system introduced? According to Michelle Alexander, yes, the new racial caste system, the legal system of racial caste that was introduced was mass incarceration. And so given that fact that we know that there was a fight to maintain the social order, it shouldn't be surprising that there was backlash to the civil rights movement. The backlash to the gains of the civil rights movement resulted in race-neutral wars, such as the war on drugs and social program reforms designed to maintain the same second-class citizenship restrictions for Blacks as during the Jim Crow era. According to Alexander, we saw the murdering of civil rights leaders. We saw new race-neutral language used for the same racist sentiment. We saw that a lot of the civil rights laws became symbolic, while racially restrictive covenants were, as an illustration in California, were no longer permitted. What we know was created instead was HOAs, or community organizations, that still enacted the same injustice, prohibiting African people and other groups of minoritized people into moving into those spaces, as an illustration. And we also saw the height of this backlash during the Reagan-Bush era, which represented a return to the racist social order of the 1950s and 60s. And we know this, as many of you may not know, the direct link between President Trump's political campaign for president and Ronald Reagan's 1980 campaign for president, which Reagan's statement was, "Let's make America great again." And he was arguing that we return to the racist social order where Blacks were pressed down into an inferior position in society. They were not treated equally, right? And then whites were elevated into a superior position. So there's some historical roots around why there was such a backlash by Black and Hispanic communities to the Make America Great Again campaign, especially given the historical legacy of Reagan, but also because the question has to be begged, when has America ever been great for African Americans, right? And as you have seen throughout this presentation, America has not demonstrated itself thus far to be great for African Americans. So African Americans continue to resist. I never end these presentations on a negative note. We talk about, and phase 2 will take us from the Black Power movement, but African Americans from the Civil Rights movement really dive more and deeper into the Black Power movement. And the Black Power movement was a culturally conscious movement that occurred in the 1960s and 70s, aimed at advancing Black self-reliance and self-determination. It emphasized racial pride, economic empowerment. It emphasized, the creation of political and cultural institutions. You see that Stokely Carmichael set a new tone for the Black freedom movement when he demanded Black power in 1966. And so we saw, as a result of this investment in Black beauty and Black intellect and Black economic mobility, and Black excellence, right? That's really where we see this Black American investment in Black excellence started here, or really being cemented here during this time frame, led to things like the Black student movement, and the establishment of Black studies in colleges and universities. And we know the first ones happened here in California at Merritt College and Community College, and then also in San Diego State University, one of our sister campuses, was one of the other first to establish a Black Studies program. And what that was a way to challenge the structures of Eurocentric education and higher education, right? And demand for more inclusive educational settings that did not exist and could not exist in the current educational structure. So the need to create what we know of Black studies and ethnic studies came out of this Black Power movement in order to say that Black excellence, Black intellect, Black history, Black arts, the Black experience, for example, Black psychology, Black sociology, Black medicine, so on and so forth, needed to be infused and incorporated into the American higher educational system. And it was through these things that that we see the birth of this this particular power movement that informs the current day Black Lives Matter movement to this day. Of course, there was backlash to these as well. Many were, they targeted the Black Panther Party, the police, the federal government labeled them as a terrorist group. We saw even on CSUN's campus, right, the demand for Black studies and equality for Black students. You saw students were arrested. Those who were immigrant students or international students were deported. Some were not at CSUN, but some students were killed in this process. some were exiled. And in the case of CSUN, some were banned from the from public educational public institutions for life. As an illustration, many walked away with criminal records. As an illustration, our own very own CSUN students in the fight for Black studies at CSUN. And so there's a lot of this historical legacy around using the legal system and law enforcement to maintain a social order, even though African Americans, what they were fighting for was not a reverse of power, but equality and inclusion in American society. And so I want to leave us on that note that ultimately African Americans and other minoritized communities fight is not for supremacy over other races, but for equal American society. They're free to pursue a reimagined American dream that's more inclusive of the ideas, the cultures, and the communities that exist in American society. So I'll end here and take any questions, if there are any. And give me.
And if anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function or just unmute yourself.
Dr. Gammage. Hello, how you doing, Dr. Gammage?
I'm good, thank you. How are you doing, Darwin?
Hey, I'm wonderful, I'm wonderful. Yeah, I got an email about the presentation you was giving today, so I said let me chime in and enlighten myself, refresh myself on.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
Do you have a question for us today?
Well, I'm just paying attention, just enlightened, and hopefully I can get a copy of this PowerPoint after tomorrow. Can you send it to me, or?
Oh yeah, Jessica, I'm willing to make the PowerPoint available for the participants today. So maybe I can send it to Jessica and she'll be able to provide the link.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you, Dr. Gammage.
Okay.
A comment from Kimberly. Darwin, did you have any questions or?
No, I was just wanted to say hello. You know what I'm saying? Hello. And then our school semester starts next month, the 24th. I'm in my last year, my master's program at SC. So,
Congratulations.
It's always good to give back to the community that gave me the platform to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Darwin is a graduate of CSUN. He was a minor in Africana Studies. So it's so good to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
I know Kimberly had a comment in the chat. Kimberly, if you're still here, did you want to elaborate on the comment that you made?
Oh, yeah. There was a previous comment made about the underfunding of King Hospital. As a graduate of King Drew Magnet High School, which is right across the street from King Hospital, a lot of the students saw firsthand what underfunding can do to a hospital. Part of our curriculum was to spend about 4 hours a week volunteering at different sites in the neighborhood. Because of the underfunding at the hospital, they moved a lot of us to other sites. And, just going through the hospital frequently during my time volunteering there, I saw a lot of the problems that were going on, and the staff and the doctors at the hospital were very talented, very competent, wanted so much for the community, but they ran up against a lot of barriers because of the underfunding. and it ended up being the staff and the doctors, and mostly who were people of color, sort of taking the blame for what was happening because of underfunding. So I just wanted to make sure that people fully understood that part of the presentation.
Yes, thank you for sharing. I appreciate your additional input. You're absolutely right. This was the case, unfortunately, not just for King Drew, but for so many of these hospitals named after our iconic civil rights figures, that was advocated for by our community, that literally our communities set the groundwork for, right? We know Ella Baker, for example, was a primary example of one of the individuals advocating for those types of spaces. But yet, because of the underfunding and the state control over salaries, payrolls, and staff, what you found was that, not just staff, but the staffing of the hospital, what you found was that, unfortunately, this created an unrealistic barrier to quality healthcare in Black communities, right? So when we're talking about underfunding, we're not just talking about the limited staff, we're talking about resources as well, right? The limited resources to provide the quality care. And during this current pandemic, we can see how detrimental that is to this day, right? We see how hospitals have been busting at the seams across the nation because they haven't had the physical space, the staff, and the resources to serve our communities at this time, given the pandemic, right? And so we see how, we can relate it to now and see how important funding and resources and staffing is, and physical space is, in order to provide quality health care. And unfortunately, that was part of the historical legacy of mistreatment of African bodies and lives in this country. And it's part of the reason why there was a need to birth a movement called the Black Lives Matter movement, because these systematic assaults and terrorism against Black lives and Black bodies teaches us that there's not value to the American government, to the state, to the public on these same lives, right? And so that was a need to birth this movement. And we'll talk more in depth about that at the second workshop. But thank you so much for sharing and giving more context to the experience that was taking place at this hospital.
And I think I saw Stephanie Barbosa's hand up. So Stephanie, if you want to ask your question.
Hi, Dr. Gammage.
Hi, Stephanie.
It's nice to see you. What my question was, or more like regarding, I would like to learn more about, because I had learned about the caste system in my Chicano studies classes, and I have been familiar with it and the way that it was used in Latin America. Mm-hmm. So hearing you bring up how, Jim Crow created a caste system here in the U.S., I had never kind of made those connections before. So I was wondering if there's more that are, or more readings or things that kind of focus on how the Jim Crow made a caste system here in the U.S. and then the long-lasting effects of that caste system.
Yes, I would definitely recommend Michelle Alexander's text, The New Jim Crow. And within that text, there are a whole lot of references, but I can also email you separately some additional ones as well for your personal readings. But that particular text really lays it out how the first wave of the racial caste was enslavement. The second phase was Jim Crow. And now the third phase is mass incarceration, and how all of those phases are inherently connected to each other. And what they do is they draw a continuum between the beginning of the racial caste to the current day, and that's in creating this legal, and that's why it's so important to see it as a racial caste system, because it's legal, a legal system of inferiority, right? A legal system of second-class citizenship. And for enslavement, we know that was a legal system, the legal system of no citizenship, right? No rights, and so on and so forth. So Michelle Alexander's text will be a great start for you, but I can also send you some more, Stephanie.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Gammage. I have that text. I haven't fully read it, so now I'm definitely going to dive into it deeper.
Good.
Thank you so much.
Good to see you.
Thanks, Steph. And I think I see Albert, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Well, first of all, Dr. Gammage, I want to say thank you. That was a great presentation. And
Thank you, Alberto.
I just wanted to make a comment real quick. A couple years back, while working on a project, we were taking on this linking these modern day lynchings and these police killings. And in the process of doing research, I ended up finding this very interesting fact that has really stuck with me over these years. And it was a fact that and it ties in directly with the mass incarceration, how it's the new caste system. But I ended up finding this fact that there has been, I can't remember if it was strictly in the South, or like I don't want to get anything wrong, but that there has been more killings of Black men through a death row than there was lynchings in the day. So it was just really like, oh my God, it was just something that kind of like helped me like get into perspective that it still exists and it's still happening to this day. It's just a different form of it. And the fact that there has been more Black men put to death through death row and incarcerated than lynchings and actual lynchings back in the day. It just blew my mind that this is still going on at such a higher rate. I was just mind blown.
Yes. So what you're speaking of are the recorded lynchings. So one, there are more African people under systems of enslavement, under systems of criminal justice, whether that's in prisons or jails, probation or parole, than there were enslaved, for instance, right? So there are more of us under this legalized system of enslavement called, right, incarceration, as an illustration, right? So we have that. And then also there have been more African Americans put to death through that role than the recorded state lynchings. So that's what you're referring to in the recorded state. So when the state has put to death African Americans via lynchings, that doesn't account for the public lynchings that we talk about via the Ku Klux Klan, through the regular public, white individuals participating in this, enacting their own level of justice. And so in terms of the recorded state lynchings as an illustration. But yes, and in fact, when we first introduced that role, lynching was our primary way of, in fact, putting to death a person in America. We first started off by lynching. We moved to lethal injections, and then, moved to the electric chair and then lethal injections, which we currently use, which is still very controversial to this day in terms of whether or not it violates the constitutional right for a person not to go through any unnecessary and undue pain and suffering in that process, right? Yeah. And so, yes, in terms of the state, put into death individuals by lynching.
Yeah, I was just mind blown that the numbers are still like growing, and it's still a very present problem.
Yes, there's still evidence of a high racial bias, and which we'll talk about more in lecture 2, but a high racial bias in terms of the criminal justice practices. And we'll talk about how incarceration in prisons were formed, and the sharecropping linked and the free labor supply linked to these prison industrial complex mirrors that of the free labor supply under enslavement.
Okay, gotcha. I'm looking forward to it.
About that in the workshop 2.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
So I do want to be mindful of time. I know it's 12:30. We have one more hand. Dr. Gammage, are you available for one more question?
Oh, okay. If I could take one more.
Okay, thank you. Kimberly, I know you had your hand up, so feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, so, we talked about mass incarceration as the new caste system, and this is a system that seems to be progressing. So I wanted to know, Dr. Gammage, do you have any predictions about the next step in this system or areas in our society that we should be concerned about? And also, I feel that as students, we are all very familiar with the feeling of crippling student debt. Are there any connections that you might be able to draw between student debt and how that is further dividing us, especially student debt in communities of color?
So one, I'll take the first part about the incarceration. Well, it's actually tied to the current call to defund the police, which when we talk about on the workshop 2, we'll see that call to defund the police is not a new call. This is actually a historic call to defund the police, to restructure the police, and so on and so forth. We saw this in the Jim Crow era during the civil rights movement, the height of the civil rights movement. We saw it. We saw it during the Black Power movement, for example. We see it now today. It's called to defund the police. Part of that has to do with the legal sanctioning of the police to target certain communities under the war on drugs, and we'll get really in depth with that on tomorrow. But literally, not only did the president call for this war on drugs, the Supreme Court upheld this practice. In U.S. v. Ponce, for example, we see racial profiling was legalized. So in fact, race is a factor in policing. And despite the empirical evidence demonstrating that African Americans do not use or sell drugs at a higher rate than white Americans, and in fact, white Americans sell drugs and use and sell drugs at a higher rate than African Americans, Black Americans are targeted more by police. Their communities are policed more by police. It is not targeted towards kingpins. And I'll show you all the data on that tomorrow and give you all the links that you can access for that as well. And what you see is that because there's an over-policing in Black communities, not because any evidence shows us that Black communities are more prone to sell or use drugs, but they're being targeted under this racial caste system, then as a result, you see higher incarceration rates. In California, for example, take, for instance, the 3 strikes law, right? That was in practice. We saw that with that 3 strikes law, it overwhelmingly was impacted African Americans. The majority of persons, it was overwhelmingly impacted by African Americans. African Americans were impacted by that, getting 25 years to life sentences for minor nonviolent drugs. You may know of that kind of case where African American male went to jail for 25 years to life for his 3rd crime, being accused of and convicted of stealing a pair of socks. That became his 3rd crime worthy of life in prison, as an illustration. So there's this systematic targeting of African Americans to keep them under these systems of control, this 2nd-class citizenship, because once you're labeled a felon, you're in most often a permanent position of 2nd-class citizenship in America. And so that creates that divide, right? Literally removing the most valuable assets from Black community, Black lives, right? Via debt or via incarceration. In terms of the student debt, that's part of the call for reparations as well. This is the part of the continuum. The fight for quality education, the call during the civil rights era was for both access to K through 12 as well as higher education. And so the access came by way, unfortunately for many minoritized communities, including African Americans, came by way of taking out student loans and student loan debt. So the current call for reparations is also linked to the cancellation of student loan debt and free access to higher education for African Americans, for African Americans call for reparations, right? To be able to have free access to that, because so social status is determined by a few things in American society. It's determined by your educational level, is determined by your income and your family legacy, right? Your family status. And so if African Americans came out of enslavement, right? Because we have to start there. Our existence in this country came through this system of enslavement, came out with $0 and 0 cents. They started off with zero capital, right? With zero status. And so as they build their way up, they have been unable to successfully transfer generations of wealth from one generation to the next generation. They haven't been able to transfer wealth, largely because of debt. The debt ratio to wealth ratio is very off for African American communities, primarily because in order for them to access some of the basic privileges in society, in American society, like higher education, home ownership, they have to go into debt for those things. And as a result of that, puts them further behind. And in terms of their status, it remains lower. And even when African Americans move up into the middle class status, it's for one generation. And then the next generation, it's back into a lower income because the level of debt that's transferred to the next generation. Even if the parents own their home, they most often have not, historically in America, have not owned it right out, since that when they pass, they're transferring debt onto their children, as an illustration. And so all of this is part of that current call, and that really this long-standing call for reparations to correct that economic inequalities that have existed, that have put African Americans further behind that put African Americans in an even deeper position to be in an unequal status in American society, because we know economic power equals political power, right? We know that. I mean, it equals cultural power. And so it is the ability to control the images on your screen, it's the ability to control the messages, the ability to control the laws, the practices, the ability to control where waste dumping sites are. And they unfortunately are primarily, 80% of them are in Black communities or near Black communities, right? And that the EPA regulates that as an illustration, right? So it's the ability to control those things. So it has significant power. And what we've been talking about is this idea that African Americans have not been able to transition from an inferior state with zero power into a position of power and privilege, because it was not designed for them in American society in the first place. So how do we transform the America itself into a more equal and inclusive society for all Americans, has been the question. I want to thank you all for this opportunity to present to you all today. I hope it's been engaging and enlightening for you all. I'm happy to share the PowerPoint. Please feel free to join us tomorrow at the same time. I'll make that PowerPoint available as well, and we'll go into the third and current stage of the racial caste system, mass incarceration, and the current call for Black Lives Matter and for social justice. Thank you all once again. Hi, Maureen.
Hi, I miss you so much.
So good to see you.
I know, I got the email and I was like, oh my gosh, I have to join. You always blow my mind, everything you say.
Oh, thank you.
Mm-hmm.